I'm Brian, and this is Game Story Basics. Hey, I wrote a book with my partner in crime, Deandra Lazarado. It's about game narrative. We have made every mistake possible in that field. So we wrote all our learnings down so you don't have to make those kind of mistakes. It's available for pre-order right now. Please check it out. I'll add a link in the description. Now let's watch this video. Hey, I want to talk about a storytelling technique that's used in film and game cinematics, but also can apply in terms of its principles to your storytelling in lots of other areas. The technique I'm referencing is intercutting. This is where you cut between two different things in a film or in a game cinematic that are not in the same location or not directly related. And you create sort of a sense of meaning between the two, right? There's the more complex version of that is the montage, but for right now, we're gonna stick with intercutting, which is just going between two things. This is used a lot in games, and unfortunately, I think it's used wrong most of the time. What I often see in games is they'll cut between, say, this epic duel between these two mighty warriors, and then they'll intercut with this massive battle that's happening on a faraway mountainside. And the problem there is that both of those things have the same energy, and the real point of intercutting is contrast, right? You want to cut between something that is dynamic and moving and fast and something that is static and powerful and slow, or some other form of contrast. So we're going to look at two different sequences from films where there's intercutting. One is the clearest and best example of what I'm talking about. The other is far more subtle. So let's start with Conan the Barbarian, the 1980 film. The opening scene is a group of cultists riding through the woods on their way to attack a village. And it's intercut with, surprise, surprise, the village. So that entire intercut sequence is going back and forth between the two until the climax is when the two intercut locations meet, when the cultists arrive at the village. But for our purposes, the intercutting is the thing. And that's where we see a really smart application of this technique, where the bad guys are coming in these really dynamic shots where there's a lot of depth and motion and movement, and every shot has a strong direction and momentum to it. And even shots that are more of sort of like a profile, what we would call limited space, there's still a lot of depth because you have stuff moving. They're all moving on the same picture plane, but some are moving in the foreground, some are moving in the middle ground, and some are moving in the foreground, creating a parallax effect. But of course, a lot of other shots, they're just coming right into camera or directly away from camera. And so it's creating all this dynamism. And on the other hand, the village is a series of peaceful shots of pastoral villagers doing pastoral villagery things, like turning a wheel or, field dressing some deer or stuff like that. What we get a really strong sense of, momentum-wise, is this really powerful force headed towards something that's not ready for it. And that's a really critical part of the intercut. You don't want to just cut between two equal things. You could, I suppose, in certain circumstances, because with all storytelling, there's no rule that applies all the time. You can always find exceptions. But for the most part, the point of the intercutting is the contrast between the two things. And you can create new meaning by that contrast. And so I think Conan's a great example of that. And if you look at just these two frames, for example, it's not just the motion, it's the framing and the composition. Although I hate to say composition when talking about film, because to me, it's framing. Composition is for something that is still. Framing is alive. It's something that moves and you're trying to capture it in your frame. But look at these two shots. Here's a village. We got these guys. They're walking in some perspective, so it's not a completely flat shot. And they're headed towards this kind of interesting little circle. And then we've got the tree line that forms a nice frame around them and the action, and it's a good shot, and it's got a little bit of dynamic diagonals in it. Now compare it to this shot of the attackers arriving at the village. You've got this big boulder in the foreground, and then the Pictish scout who has stood up right at the beginning of this shot turns into this big triangle, and then just incredibly he's got these two waves of horsemen going by on either side in deep perspective. That kind of thing, that contrast of shot can really create the story that you're trying to tell when you do intercutting. And of course, it's always great when intercutting can end with the two things you've been intercutting between smashing together, although it doesn't always have to be that way. This is just maybe the best in class example of that. The other example is really instructive because it uses the same principles, but in a very different way, and a more subtle way, which is not necessarily better, just different. And that's the movie No Hard Feelings with Jennifer Lawrence. And this is a scene, it actually is two characters in the same location, but they're sitting at a table, and then the guy walks away. And as soon as he is 10 feet away from her, we never see the two of them in a two-shot again for this intercutting section. So for all intents and purposes, we are intercutting between two different things. And in this case, the intercutting is really about the acting. The camera work between the two is very subtle. There's just a slow push in on one, a slow push in on the other, slow push in on one, slow push in on the other, static close-up shot, static close-up shot. It's very, very subtle camera work that's not really calling attention to itself. But what is really happening is that we are intercutting between a guy who is singing and playing the piano and is kind of twitchy. You'll see he kind of looks over his shoulder and he's kind of looking around and he's very unsure. And over the course of intercutting, every time we come back to him, he's a little more confident because he's getting lost in the performance of what he's doing. He has this entire story arc in these series of shots of his own. Amazing. Jennifer Lawrence has to do something equally hard, but very, very different. And that's this. She is sitting very still. And as the intercutting goes on, she grows more and more still. And by itself, that would tell us something as viewers. We would start to realize, when a character stops reacting a lot on the outside, if the actor is doing a good job, which she is, we start to think more about what's going on the inside. And that's definitely what's happening here. But when you contrast that with the growing confidence of the guy playing the piano, every time we come back to her, her stillness starts to scream even louder. And we've talked a lot about contrast and how contrast can tell your story. And this is it. I mean, she's just sitting so still that in this very late shot, when she has a twinge in her neck, it's almost like she jumped up and started screaming, both because of the contrast of her being so still that little bit of motion does something to us. And then also the contrast of what's going on with him. The intercutting is telling two stories, each an interesting story on its own, but the contrast between them as he kind of goes up and she sort of falls down emotionally makes it incredibly powerful. So two great performances, really subtle thinking by the director in terms of how much to insert the camera work and the cinema into it, and how much just to let it breathe. But intercutting between these two things, very powerful. Great example of how it's done. That's all for now. I'll see you on the next one.